On a freezing winter day, a kind waitress gave two hungry orphans a bowl of soup and lost her job for it. 20 years later, Mia Harper's quiet life is interrupted when a sleek black Lamborghini pulls up and two strangers step out. They're Liam and Ava, the children she once saved, now grown and successful. What they reveal will clear her name, expose the lies that ruined her, and prove that one small act of kindness can change everything. Mia hadn't had a visitor in 10 years when that Christmas Eve rolled around in 2023. Not since the town called her a thief, not since the church called her worse. The whispers followed her like shadows in those days. And I watched from this very window as neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past her little house on Maple Street. But on that particular Christmas Eve night, when that black Lamborghini purred up her broken driveway like a cat stalking prey, well, some debts don't stay buried forever. And the two figures stepping out of that gleaming car carried the kind of reckoning that only comes when the hungry get fed and the liars get found. The headlights cut through the December darkness, illuminating her old soup kitchen sign, hanging crooked on its rusty chain. Soul Stew. It had read once back when the letters weren't faded and the hope wasn't gone. The paint was peeling now, 20 years of weather having taken its toll. But somehow those words still held power, still meant something to folks who remembered. A man stepped out first, his movements careful and deliberate. Even from my window 3 houses down, I could see he was tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who'd learned to carry himself with purpose. His gloved hand clutched something small and stained. My old eyes weren't what they used to be, but I could tell it was a napkin, old and yellowed with age. A napkin from 2003, as it would turn out. But why they'd waited 20 years to come back, and why Sophia Crane's name was scribbled on that napkin in what looked suspiciously like dried blood, well, that's where our story truly begins. The woman who emerged from the passenger side moved with the grace of someone who'd fought battles and won them. Someone who'd learned that victory sometimes tastes like soup and sometimes like justice. Her hair caught the streetlight, and for a moment, I thought I was seeing a ghost. But ghosts don't drive Lamborghini, and ghosts don't carry briefcases full of legal documents that would topple an empire built on the suffering of children. You see, December 17, 2003, was the day Mia Harper lost her job and found her soul. I remember it clear as yesterday, because that was the morning my Helen made her last batch of Christmas cookies before the cancer took her voice away. The snow was falling thick that morning, the kind that makes the whole world look clean, even when it's rotten underneath. From my kitchen window, I watched the flakes dance in the amber glow of the streetlights, each one perfect and unique, just like the souls we meet in this life. Mia had been working the morning shift at Mickey's Diner over on Commerce Street, pouring coffee for truckers and serving up eggs that had seen better days. It was honest work for honest pay, and Mia had never asked for more than that. She was the kind of woman who said please and thank you to everyone, who remembered how customers liked their coffee, who slipped extra bacon to the construction workers who reminded her of her daddy. Mickey's wasn't much to look at. Truth be told, the linoleum was cracked. The booths were held together with duct tape and prayer, and the coffee machine made sounds like a dying cat when it was brewing. But it was warm, and it smelled like home cooking. And for folks who didn't have much of either, it was a sanctuary. Mia understood that. She'd made it her mission to make sure everyone who walked through those doors felt like they belonged somewhere, even if it was just for the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. But then they walked in, and everything changed. Liam and Ava, 7 and 9 years old, respectively, though their eyes looked decades older. They weren't beggars, mind you. Ghosts is what they were, with ribs like prison bars showing through. There, thin jackets and fingers so pale they looked translucent. Their shoes had holes that let the snow seep through, and Ava kept stomping her feet to keep the feeling in her toes, making little squeaking sounds on the worn linoleum. They stood by the door like they weren't sure they were allowed to come. in their eyes taking in the warmth and the smell of food with the kind of hunger that goes deeper than the stomach. Liam had his arm around his sister's shoulders, protective in the way that children learn to be when adults fail them. Ava clutched the paper bag that looked like it held everything she owned in this world. When Mia saw them huddled by the door, something stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt since she was their age. Standing in the kitchen of Sister Margaret's orphanage, watching the other children fight over scraps, she remembered the taste of watered-down gruel and the ache of going to bed with an empty stomach. She remembered Sister Margaret's ruler across her knuckles when she was caught stealing bread for the smaller children. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Sister Margaret had been a woman who believed suffering built character, that hunger taught gratitude, and that children were born sinful and needed to be purged of their wickedness through deprivation. Stealing bread gets you the closet, the old nun would say, her voice sharp as winter wind, her eyes cold as January frost. But sharing it gets you the strap. Mia could still feel the welts that strap had left, could still remember the taste of her own blood when she bit her tongue to keep from crying out. But what Sister Margaret never understood was that every blow of that strap only strengthened Mia's resolve to be different, to be better, to be the kind of person who saw hunger and filled it instead of using it as a weapon. Looking at these two children, Mia saw herself 30 years back, all hollow cheeks and desperate hope. Without a word, she moved to the soup pot and ladled out the biggest bowl the diner had. Thick with vegetables and chunks of beef that cost more than her hourly wage, the soup was her own recipe, something she'd been perfecting for months, adding herbs and spices she bought with her own money to make it taste like love felt warm. She slid the bowl across the counter along with a basket of crackers and 2 glasses of milk that she'd pay for herself if she had to. The milk was fresh and cold, the kind of white that promised nutrition and comfort. She added a pat of butter to the crackers, knowing that sometimes it's the small luxuries that remind us we're human. Na's eyes went wide as saucers when she saw that feast spread before them. She grabbed a handful of crackers and stuffed them in her sock with the quick, furtive movements of someone who'd learned that food was never guaranteed. For later, she whispered, as if speaking too loud might make the bounty disappear like a mirage in the desert. Liam said nothing, just stared at that bowl like it was the Holy Grail itself. His hand shook as he picked up the spoon, and I imagined Mia could see the prayer of gratitude in his eyes, the kind of thanksgiving that comes from the very depths of the soul. When he took that first sip, his whole body relaxed for maybe the first time in months. Frank Davis, the dishwasher, who'd been working at Mickey's since before televisions were color, shuffled over and watched the children eat. He was a man of few words, carved from granite and weathered by time. But when he did speak, folks listened. His hands were scarred from years of washing dishes in scalding water, and his back was bent from decades of standing over industrial sinks, but his eyes were sharp and kind. "Kid," he said to Mia, his voice rough as sandpaper dragged across concrete, "you just fed 2 wolves. The problem is one's named Sophia." Now, Sophia Crane was the kind of woman who wore her cruelty like jewelry, all shiny and displayed for the world to see. She managed the day shift at Mickey's with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. And she had eyes like a hawk and twice the mean streak. She'd been watching Mia and those children from across the diner, her red lipstick pursed in disapproval that could freeze coffee in the cup. Sophia believed in rules the way some people believe in religion, with zealous fervor and no room for interpretation. There was a rule about not serving people who couldn't pay, a rule about portion control, a rule about everything that might interfere with the profit margin. She kept those rules written down in a little notebook she carried, adding new ones whenever she caught someone showing too much humanity. Her office was in the back of the diner, a cramped space that smelled of cigarettes and cheap perfume. The walls were covered with employee schedules, health department certificates, and photographs of Sophia with various local dignitaries. She kept a calculator on her desk at all times, constantly running numbers, always looking for ways to squeeze more profit from less investment. But Mia had learned something important in those orphanage years, something that Sophia would never understand. Kindness ain't free. It's a debt the world collects with interest, and the interest rate varies, depending on how much love you put into the principle. And sure enough, as those children finished their soup and warmed their hands on the empty bowl, Sophia's scream cut through the diner like a knife through silk. "Where's the cash?" The tip jar was gone. $2,347 that Mia had been saving for her mother's Christmas present had vanished like smoke in wind. It wasn't much money, not to most folks, but to Mia, it represented hours of refilled coffee cups and patient smiles, small kindnesses that added up to something meaningful. Sophia's painted nails left moon-shaped cuts on Mia's arm as she grabbed her French manicure, drawing blood from skin that had already been weathered by years of honest work. "I saw you with those little thieves," Sophia hissed. Her breath smelled of coffee and spite and something rotten underneath. "You're all in it together, aren't you? Running some kind of scam on my diner." The accusation hit Mia like a physical blow. In all her years of working, in all her years of serving others, no one had ever questioned her honesty. Her integrity was the one thing she'd managed to keep intact through all the hardships of her life. The one treasure that couldn't be stolen or lost or broken. The police came within the hour, their boots heavy on the cracked linoleum, their questions sharp and suspicious. Officer Ramirez was kind enough, but Officer Peterson had the look of a man who'd already made up his mind before he walked through the door. They took statements from Sophia, from Frank Davis, from the 3 customers who'd been in the diner when the jar disappeared. The children were long gone by then, vanished into the December cold, like they'd never existed at all. But the empty bowl remained on the counter, a testament to the meal that had started this whole chain of events. Mia stared at that bowl while the officers questioned her, wondering if she'd somehow brought this on herself by daring to show compassion. The manager came next, Mr. Collins, a thin man who looked like he'd been pressed flat by the weight of corporate expectations. He'd been running Mickey's for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never had an employee accused of theft. His hands shook as he filled out the paperwork, as if the very act of firing someone might contaminate him with their supposed dishonesty. By evening, there was a pink slip in Mia's locker and a notice that read, "Terminated for theft," in Sophia's careful handwriting. But the real crime wasn't the missing money, though that stung deep enough. The real crime was that napkin, the one Mia had used to wipe Ava's chin when the child had dripped soup down her jacket. Later, much later, Mia would remember the details that didn't make sense at the time. The way Sophia had lingered by the children's table after they'd left. The way she'd picked up that napkin and examined it closely before stuffing it in her apron pocket. The way she'd smiled when she thought no one was looking. A smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with satisfaction. That napkin had Sophia's lipstick print on it, sure enough, but it also had something else. Numbers written in what looked like Liam's shaky child's handwriting. Numbers that, when arranged correctly, formed the combination to the diner's safe. Numbers that no customer should have known. Numbers that Sophia herself had written down and left carelessly on the counter that morning when she'd been rushing to make the bank deposit. The security cameras in Mickey's were old and unreliable. And wouldn't you know it, the footage from 3:07 p.m. that afternoon was mysteriously corrupted. Technical malfunction, the company said when the police asked to review the tapes. Happens all the time with equipment that old. Joe knew better though. As Mia cleaned out her locker that night, her hands shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak, he shuffled over with his characteristic limp and whispered words that would haunt her for years to come. "Jess's brother runs the shelter those kids vanished from," he said. his eyes darting toward the kitchen where Sophia was counting the days with unusual thoroughness. Funny how kids keep disappearing from there, and Jess keeps getting bonuses for operational efficiency. The pieces of a larger puzzle were scattered around them, but Mia was too hurt and too shocked to put them together just yet. All she could think about was the unfairness of it all. The way 20 years of honest work could be erased by one moment of compassion gone wrong. That night, as Mia walked home through the snow that had turned from beautiful to treacherous, she caught one last glimpse of Liam and Ava. They were being loaded into a Child Protective Services van, their small forms dwarfed by the official-looking adults who surrounded them. Ava was crying, her tears freezing on her cheeks in the bitter cold. But Liam wasn't crying at all. He was staring straight at Mia through the back window of that van, his young face set with a determination that seemed far too mature for his 7 years. His lips moved in 2 words she'd never forget. 2 words that would echo in her mind for the next 20 years. "We'll come back." The van pulled away into the night, taking those children back to whatever hell they'd escaped from. And Mia stood in the falling snow, wondering if she had just witnessed her own destruction or theirs. The next morning brought news that made Mia's blood run cold and her heart break all over again. Soul's stew, the little soup kitchen she'd been dreaming of opening with her life savings, had been condemned by the city. The building she'd put a deposit on, the place where she'd planned to serve meals to anyone who needed them, was suddenly structurally unsound, according to an inspector's report that appeared overnight, like mushrooms after rain. The report was signed by Inspector James Ford, who just happened to be married to Sophia's cousin. The condemnation order was co-signed by Deputy Mayor Richard Palmer, who just happened to be Sophia's new boyfriend, and would soon become her husband in a wedding that the society pages would call the social event of the season. Funny how love and politics make such convenient bedfellows, how money and power seem to flow together like cream stirred into coffee. Mia's deposit, every cent she'd saved over 5 years of working double shifts and skipping meals, was forfeit according to the fine print of the lease agreement. No refunds for acts of God or municipal action. Standing in front of that condemned building on the morning of December 19, 2003, Mia felt something die inside her chest. Not her kindness, not her desire to help others, but her faith in the system that was supposed to protect people like her. The system that was supposed to reward hard work and punish those who took advantage of the vulnerable. The wrecking ball came that very afternoon. As if the city couldn't wait to erase every trace of Mia's dreams. She stood in the crowd of onlookers, watching 20 years of planning and hoping crumble into dust and broken brick. The sound of destruction was deafening, but somehow she could still hear the echo of her own voice, explaining to the bank officer how she planned to serve free meals to anyone who walked through those doors. As the dust settled and the debris was loaded into trucks, Mia spotted 2 familiar faces in the crowd of onlookers. But they weren't crying like some of the neighbors who'd known about her plans. They weren't looking sad or sympathetic. They were counting. Their lips moved as each piece of debris fell, as each wall crumbled, and Mia realized they were memorizing something important. Later, much later, she would understand that Liam and Eva were storing away every detail of that destruction, filing it in their young minds alongside every injustice they'd witnessed, every cruelty they endured. They were building a case even at 7 and 9 years old, gathering evidence for a reckoning that was still 20 years away. With no job and no prospects, no references, and no hope of finding work in a town where everyone had heard about her theft, Mia's dreams of a soup kitchen became something much smaller and more desperate. A shopping cart liberated from the grocery store parking lot, a portable hot plate purchased at a thrift store, a card table that wobbled but held steady under the weight of hope that she set up under the Morrison Street Bridge where the homeless veterans gathered and the city's forgotten People found shelter from both the elements and the judgmental eyes of respectable society. The concrete walls were covered with graffiti that told stories of love and loss, of dreams deferred and promises broken. But there was also beauty there. Murals painted by artists who understood that sometimes the most honest art comes from the darkest places. The homeless veterans who gathered there became her guardians. Men and women who'd seen too much war and too little peace, who understood what it meant to be discarded by a society that had once called them heroes. Sergeant Andrew Wells had lost his left leg in Desert Storm and his family to his own inability to come home. Vera Thompson had served 3 tours in Vietnam as an army nurse and came back to a country that spat on her uniform and forgot her. Service. "You fed my kid, lady," Torres told her one cold January evening, his eyes soft despite the scars that covered half his face. Jimmy was one of those kids you used to slip extra pancakes to on Sunday mornings. Now we feed you. They formed a protective circle around her makeshift kitchen. These broken soldiers who'd learned that the most important battles are fought, not with weapons but with compassion. They helped her carry water, donated cans of food from their own meager supplies, and stood guard while she cooked, making sure that no one bothered the woman who'd chosen to feed others when she could barely feed herself. In that dented recipe box she carried, wrapped in plastic bags to protect it from the rain, Mia kept more than just cooking instructions. Every napkin with a thank you note, every scrap of paper where someone had written their name to prove they'd existed, every small token of gratitude from folks she'd fed. The box became a repository of human dignity, proof that kindness given is kindness returned. There were letters from truck drivers who remembered her coffee, from college students who'd scraped together enough change for a meal during finals, from single mothers who brought their children to Mickey's because it was the only place they could afford to eat out. Each piece of paper told a story, and each story mattered. Buried at the bottom of that box, wrapped in plastic like a precious relic, was a photograph she'd found blowing in the wind after the wrecking ball had done its work. Someone had dropped it, or maybe thrown it away, thinking no one would ever notice. But Mia had noticed, and she'd picked it up, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice water. It showed Sophia handing a thick envelope to Richard Carlson, the CPS director. Both of them smiling like they just closed a particularly profitable business deal. They were standing outside the Cedar Ridge group home, the same facility where Liam and Ava had supposedly been living before they wandered into Mickey's that December morning. The timestamp on the photo read 2003, one day after Liam and Eva had disappeared back into the system. One day after Mia had lost everything she'd worked for. One day after Sophia Crane had gotten exactly what she wanted. For 10 long years, Mia ladled soup from that shopping cart under the Morrison Street bridge. She served construction workers who were between jobs, college students whose financial aid had run out, runaways who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. She fed retired teachers whose pensions had been stolen, disabled veterans waiting for benefits that might never come, and immigrant families whose dreams of America had run headfirst into the reality of poverty. Each bowl of soup carried a story, and each story carried weight that settled in Mia's bones like sediment in a river. She began to understand that she wasn't just feeding bodies. She was feeding souls, nourishing the part of humanity that society had forgotten or abandoned. But late at night, when the bridge was empty, except for the sound of traffic overhead and the whistle of wind through the steel girders, Mia would sometimes wonder if she was really saving souls or just drowning her own shame in an endless sea of hunger that could never be fully satisfied. The doubt crept in during the hardest times when the police would come and tell them to move along, when city officials would confiscate her cart for health code violations, and when well-meaning citizens would complain about the unsightly gathering of desperate people in their clean, safe neighborhood. Some nights she'd lie on her cot in the women's shelter and wonder if Sophia Crane had been right. Is she really was just enabling people who should be taking care of themselves? But then morning would come and someone would approach her cart with hollow eyes and empty hands. And Mia would remember why she'd started doing this in the first place. Soup isn't just food, she'd learned. It's evidence. Evidence that someone saw you when the world looked away. Evidence that you mattered when everything else said you didn't. Evidence that love can be measured by the tablespoon and served up hot when everything else has gone cold. The years drifted by, each bringing fresh faces and familiar desires. Mia's hair, once vibrant, faded to gray, then white, and the constant motion of ladling soup and stirring pots left her hands aching with arthritis. Her back bowed from carrying heavy water jugs and folding tables, and her feet flattened from standing on concrete day after day. Yet, through it all, her smile never faltered, her ladle remained full, and her belief in the inherent goodness of people somehow endured, despite the harshness the world hurled at her. Then, on a Tuesday in March 2013, a fire tore everything apart. It had been almost 10 years to the day since she had lost her job at Mickey's. Mia had just served lunch to about 40 people when Jake Reynolds, a veteran struggling with addiction and personal demons, stumbled too close to the propane tank, cigarette in hand. The explosion was swift, if not huge. The flames spread rapidly through her makeshift kitchen, devouring months of careful work in minutes. The shopping cart, hot plate, and card table, her humble altar of service, all reduced to ashes and twisted metal before the fire department could respond. But the greatest loss was the recipe box, a treasure trove of gratitude. 2 decades worth of thank you notes and napkin scribbles. Proof of the impact of her work, proof of kindness given and returned, now gone in an instant. As the fire raged, Tommy, burned with second-degree wounds on his face and arms, kept apologizing, his cracked lips trembling. "I'm sorry, Miss Mia," he murmured over and over, even as he was taken away in the ambulance. Despite her loss, her heart still heavy with grief, Mia held his burned hand and whispered, "It's all right, honey. Things can be replaced. You can't be." Captain Garcia, the fire investigator, found Mia sitting on a broken slab of concrete, her gaze fixed on the ruins of her kitchen. "I'm sorry for your loss," Garcia said softly, her sympathy sincere. She had seen many fires, but the difference between losing possessions and losing purpose was clear. Yet not everything had burned. Amidst the scorched metal, one item had survived the flames, a business card, its edges singed but the text still readable. Crane Holdings, creating solutions for tomorrow's challenges. The card was cream-colored, elegant, hinting at power. On the back, a cryptic note, "See her home, monthly payments, keep quiet." The words, faded but legible, made Mia's pulse quicken. The card pointed to something long buried, Doser Home, Cedar Ridge Group Home, the place where Liam and Ava had vanished 2 decades ago. And the monthly payments could only mean one thing: someone was being paid to keep quiet about whatever had happened there. The card was tied to Sophia Crane's empire, the one built from the misfortune of others. It became Mia's obsession, her guiding star. Every morning, she woke with the determination to rebuild what the fire had destroyed. Her nights were spent at the public library, sifting through public records, tax documents, and old files until her eyes burned with fatigue. Mrs. Lee, the elderly librarian, would bring her coffee and gently remind her to rest. "You're searching for something specific," Mrs. Lee said one evening as Mia rubbed her weary eyes. "Justice," Mia replied quietly, the weight of her words settling in. "I'm looking for justice." As she dug deeper into the financial records, Mia found a story that made her stomach churn. Crane Holdings' tax returns revealed a systematic structure built on human suffering. A line item in the 2012 returns read Dining Solutions, $12,000 per month from Cedar Ridge Group Home, year after year. But the truth behind those figures was darker than Mia could have imagined. Cedar Ridge wasn't just a temporary placement. For children, it was a place where children worked in kitchens for other state institutions, and where state funds meant for their care were being siphoned off. The records showed how money intended for children's well-being was diverted to Crane Holdings for supposed consulting services that were little more than teaching hungry children how to cook food they weren't allowed to eat. The deeper Mia dug, the more she uncovered. Cedar Ridge had been receiving state funding, but the children there weren't receiving an education, nor were they getting proper care. They were working as labor in industrial kitchens. They were receiving medical treatment from a nurse practitioner with a tarnished record. And worst of all, the money meant for their nutrition was being funneled to Crane Holdings. All of it led to one person, Sophia Crane, now Sophia West, wife of the deputy mayor. Sophia had created a vast empire, using the misery of vulnerable children as her foundation. But there was a twist to this tale, one that Mia hadn't anticipated. Liam and Eva hadn't just survived. They had thrived. Liam, with nothing but a smartphone app, had founded Nourish, an organization that provided free meals to communities in need, turning surplus food from restaurants into resources for families. By 2020, Nourish had grown into a multi-million-dollar organization, far surpassing Crane Holdings' ambitions. Eva, on the other hand, became a fierce advocate for children in the legal world, fighting against a system that had failed them. She had started Hopper and Associates, a law firm specializing in cases that nobody else would touch. It was named in honor of a diner worker who had shown her kindness when no one else would. Together, Liam and Eva had gathered evidence against Sophia and her brother for years. They'd been patient, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. When that moment came, they would not just take down Crane Holdings, they would dismantle an empire built on cruelty. That Christmas Eve, Mia's quiet life was interrupted by a black Lamborghini. It wasn't theirs at first. It had belonged to Sophia West. But now, the car was in Mia's hands, along with the deed to a valuable downtown property. It was a small victory, but not the real reason they had come. Eva stepped out of the Lamborghini, her professional demeanor cracking for just a moment when she saw Mia. For a brief second, she was the 9-year-old girl again, clutching a paper bag and grateful for a bowl of soup and the kindness of a stranger. The two had come to deliver more than just money, they had come to deliver justice. The napkin from Mia's soup kitchen, the one that had started everything, was now wrapped in plastic, preserved as evidence. When the story finally broke in, January 2024, the press called it the soup kitchen scandal. But for those who had been watching, it was a reckoning. 20 years in the making, a reminder that sometimes the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, but sometimes it needs a little help. But words are just air until they're backed up by evidence, and the evidence that Eva and Liam had compiled over 2 decades was devastating in its scope and damning in its detail. Financial records showed money meant for children's meals being diverted to personal accounts. Medical records revealed systematic neglect and abuse. Employment records showed children as young as 8 being used as unpaid labor in commercial kitchens. The recording that Eva played for the packed courtroom was 20 years old, but the digital restoration technology that Liam's company had developed made every word as clear as if it had been spoken yesterday. Sophia's voice, younger but just as cold, outlined her plan to use the group home children as free labor while collecting full payment for their care. "Those kids are worth more working than eating," Sophia's recorded voice said with clinical detachment. "Let them think that soup kitchen woman stole their money. Keeps them grateful and keeps them quiet. And if any of them get too mouthy, well, we could always arrange for them to disappear into the system somewhere else. Who's going to miss a couple of throwaway kids?" The community revolt that followed was something to see. An uprising of conscience that reminded everyone why democracy sometimes works despite itself. Homeless families stormed the city council chambers, carrying signs with Mia's picture and testimonies about meals she'd served under that bridge. Former group home residents, now adults with families of their own, came forward with stories that made hardened reporters weep. "She fed us," they chanted, their voices echoing off the marble walls of power, bouncing back at the politicians who'd enabled Sophia's system of abuse through their willful blindness and corrupt complicity. She fed us when nobody else would. She saw us when nobody else cared. The mayor, faced with overwhelming evidence of his administration's complicity in 20 years of systematic child abuse, called an emergency press conference where he announced his immediate resignation. The deputy mayor, Sophia's husband, was arrested before he could follow suit. The city council voted unanimously to void every contract Crane Holdings had ever received, and the state attorney general announced a criminal investigation that would eventually reach into dozens of similar facilities across the region. But Liam's testimony was the bomb that leveled Sophia's empire entirely. The killing blow was delivered with the precision of someone who'd been planning it for 20 years. His forensic accounting, backed up by teams of investigators and data analysts, proved that Crane Holdings had embezzled $2.8 million from school lunch programs over the past decade. Money meant to feed children was redirected to Sophia's personal accounts, vacation homes, and luxury cars. The numbers were staggering, but it was the human cost that truly broke hearts in that courtroom. Liam spoke in a voice that remained steady despite the tears streaming down his face, describing how he and his sister had been forced to work 16-hour days in commercial kitchens, preparing thousands of meals for school districts while being fed nothing but thin gruel and stale bread. "We made food for other children while we starved," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of accumulated pain. "We prepared birthday cakes for school celebrations while we forgot what cake tasted like. We packaged lunches for field trips we would never take to places we would never see for childhoods we would never have." Na's testimony was equally devastating, but delivered with the clinical precision of someone who'd learned to weaponize her pain in service of justice. She detailed the systematic abuse that went beyond mere hunger, describing how children who complained or asked questions were punished with solitary confinement, how medical care was withheld as a form of control, and how education was replaced with labor that generated profit for Sophia's empire. "They didn't just steal our food," Nina said, her voice cutting through the silence of the packed courtroom like a blade through cloth. "They stole our childhoods, our health, our futures. They turned us into commodities, bought and sold and traded like livestock. And when we dared to dream of something better, when we dared to believe we deserved more than scraps and cruelty, they made sure we knew our place." The climax came on the third day of testimony when Sophia, finally realizing that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her like a house built on sand, lunged across the courtroom at Mia in a final act of desperate rage. She moved like a woman possessed, her face twisted with 20 years of accumulated hatred for the person who'd shown kindness when Sophia had demanded only submission. But Mia, weathered by 20 years of serving soup to desperate people and strengthened by decades of choosing love over fear, caught Sophia's wrist with hands that remained steady despite everything she'd endured. The courtroom held its breath as these two women faced each other across 20 years of pain and injustice. Predator and prey switched roles in a moment that felt like cosmic justice finally asserting itself. "You starved them," Mia said, her voice calm as still water, carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You took children who had nothing and you gave them less than nothing. You turned their hunger into your profit and their pain into your pleasure. I saved you the trouble of having a conscience." The judge, a stern woman who'd seen too many cases of institutional abuse, but never one quite this systematic, sentenced Sophia to 15 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to every child who'd been harmed by her operation. The Amount was staggering, over $40 million when accounting for lost wages, medical costs, psychological damage, and punitive damages. But money, as important as it was, couldn't undo 20 years of trauma. What mattered more was the symbolic victory, the knowledge that someone had finally been held accountable for treating children like commodities instead of human beings. What mattered was the message sent to every other Sophia Crane operating in the shadows that their time of reckoning would come. The mayor, faced with his own corruption charges and overwhelming evidence of his administration's complicity, held one final press conference before disappearing into federal protection and a plea deal that would keep him out of prison in exchange for his cooperation. At that conference, with shaking hands and a voice that cracked with something that might have been genuine remorse, he tore up every eviction notice his office had ever served against Mia's various soup kitchens. And Liam, tears streaming down his face as he watched 20 years of planning finally come to fruition, handed Mia a key. Not to the Lamborghini, though that was part of the package. Not to money, though there was plenty of that too. The key was to something far more valuable, something that represented the completion of a circle that had begun with a bowl of soup on a snowy December morning. The new Soul's Stew opened 6 months later in the heart of downtown, a gleaming facility that looked like a restaurant, but operated like a mission. The building had been Sophia's headquarters, the place where she'd planned her empire of exploitation. But now it hummed with the sound of industrial mixers preparing soup for anyone who needed it. The kitchen was state-of-the-art, capable of serving 500 meals a day, but it was designed with dignity in mind. The dining room looked like a real restaurant with tablecloths and flowers and music playing softly in the background. There were no lines, no numbers, no degrading processes designed to make people feel ashamed of their hunger. There were just tables and chairs and servers who understood that food is love made visible. The gold plaque by the door read simply, "No one leaves hungry." But underneath, in smaller letters that most people missed unless they were looking for it, were the words that really mattered, in memory of every child who went to bed hungry, and in hope that no child ever will again. Even Sophia, working off her community service in the kitchen, while serving the first year of her sentence under a work release program, learned something about the dignity of honest labor and the satisfaction of feeding others instead of feeding off them. She worked in silence mostly, her designer clothes replaced by a simple apron, her manicured nails broken from honest work. At first, she did the work with resentful compliance, going through the motions without understanding the mission. But gradually something began to change. Maybe it was seeing the gratitude in people's eyes when they received a meal. Maybe it was understanding finally what it meant to give instead of take. Or maybe it was simply the weight of 20 years of accumulated guilt finally finding a constructive outlet. One evening, as they were closing up the kitchen, Sophia approached Mia with something that might have been an apology, struggling to escape from lips that had never learned how to form such words. "I don't know how to say sorry for 20 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had caused so much pain, who had turned cruelty into a business model and suffering into profit. Then she handed Sophia a ladle and said simply, "Start with tomorrow's soup." Zara adopted a little girl from Cedar Ridge Group Home during the facility's closure. A child with hollow eyes and 2 thin arms who reminded everyone of 2 orphans who'd walked into a diner 20 years before. The girl had been in the system for 3 years, passed from home to home, failed by every institution meant to protect her. "Her name's Mia," Zara announced at the grand opening celebration, the little girl clinging to her hand like a lifeline while taking in the warmth and abundance of the new Soul's Stew with eyes that couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. And she's going to grow up knowing that the world has people in it who will feed her when she's hungry and hold her when she's scared. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was the cycle completing itself. Trauma transformed into healing. Pain converted into purpose. The little girl would grow up in a world where Sophia Crane's empire of exploitation had been replaced by Mia Harper's legacy of compassion, where the very building that had once housed meetings about maximizing profit from human misery now served free meals to anyone who needed them. Frank Davis, now 94 and still sharp as the day is long despite his bent back and slow shuffle, came to the grand opening ceremony, leaning heavily on a walker, but refusing all offers to sit down. He'd outlived Mickey's Diner, outlived the three owners, and outlived his own expectations of how long a dishwasher could keep going on stubbornness and spite. He shuffled up to Mia during the ceremony, his eyes still bright despite the clouded cataracts, and delivered his verdict on 20 years of struggle and redemption. "Kid," he said, his voice still rough as sandpaper dragged across concrete, "you fed the wolves, and they remembered." Funny how that works when you give instead of take. But perhaps the most beautiful moment came on a snowy December evening. Exactly 20 years after that first bowl of soup that had started this whole chain of events. Mia was closing up the kitchen when she heard humming from the dining room. A sound so pure and sweet, it seemed to make the very air shimmer with joy. There sat Zara, now a successful lawyer and mother, humming, "You Are My Sunshine," while her daughter colored at one of the tables. The little girl was using bright yellow crayons to draw what looked like a bowl of soup, with steam rising from it in spirals that turned into musical notes. "My grandmother used to sing that to me at the first orphanage," Na said when she saw Mia watching from the kitchen doorway. "Before the hunger got so bad, we forgot how to sing. Before we learned that music was a luxury we couldn't afford, you gave that back to us. You know, the ability to remember joy, the permission to hope for better things." Mia's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for 2 decades. Salt water that tasted like vindication, sorrow, and gratitude all mixed together. All those years of doubt, all those nights wondering if she'd done the right thing. If one bowl of soup could really matter in a world so full of cruelty and indifference, here was her answer, humming softly in the warm light of a kitchen filled with hope instead of hunger. The old recipe box was gone, burned in that fire all those years ago. But Mia had learned that the most important recipes aren't written down anyway. They're passed from heart to heart, from one hungry soul to another, in the simple act of seeing someone's need and choosing to fill it. They're measured not in cups and teaspoons, but in compassion and courage, seasoned with justice and served with the understanding that we're all just temporary stewards of whatever abundance we're blessed to receive. Feed one mouth, you save a body. Feed a soul, you save generations. As I finish this tale, sitting in my chair by the window where I've watched the world change for nearly a century, I can see the soul stew from here. The lights are always on, the door never locked, steam rising from the kitchen like prayers ascending to heaven. The building glows with warmth in the December darkness. A beacon for anyone who needs to remember that kindness still exists in a world that sometimes seems to have forgotten how to care. Sometimes late at night when the snow is falling and the world is quiet except for the whisper of wind through bare branches, I see a black Lamborghini pull up. 2 figures get out. No longer the hollow-eyed children they once were, but successful adults who never forgot where they came from, or who helped them survive their darkest hours. They roll up their sleeves and help serve soup to whoever needs it, their faces reflecting the same kindness that Mia showed them all those years ago. Liam, now in his late 20s, moves through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who learned early how precious food can be. He's expanded Nourish to serve meals in 12 cities, partnering with formerly homeless individuals to run the local operations, creating jobs for people who understand hunger from the inside out. His company doesn't just deliver food, it delivers dignity, respect, and the revolutionary idea that everyone deserves to eat well, regardless of their ability to pay. Eva works with local lawmakers to reform the child welfare system, using her legal expertise and personal experience to craft legislation that prioritizes children's well-being over institutional convenience. She's helped pass laws requiring more stringent oversight of group homes, better funding for nutrition programs, and harsher penalties for anyone who profits from child abuse. Together, they've created a foundation that bears Mia's name, providing grants to soup kitchens and food pantries across the country. But more than money, they provide something that can't be quantified: hope. Hope that systems can change, that justice can prevail, that kindness planted in darkness can grow into something beautiful and transformative. The Lamborghini itself has become something of a legend. The neighborhood Liam had it repainted from black to sunny yellow, and Ava had the words "free meals" inside, printed on the doors in letters that can't be missed. It's not just transportation anymore. It's a mobile advertisement for the power of redemption, a rolling reminder that even the vehicles of the corrupt can be transformed into tools of healing. And sometimes, if you listen closely when the wind is just right and the night is very still, you can hear something floating on the air from that kitchen. Not just the clatter of ladles and the bubble of simmering broth, but something else. Something that sounds suspiciously like hope, like healing, like the echo of a 9-year-old girl's voice humming, "You are my sunshine," while she colors pictures of soup bowls and dreams of a world where no child goes hungry. The veterans under the Morrison Street Bridge still gather sometimes, though most of them have found housing through programs that Eva helped establish. They come to the Soul Stew not because they need the meals, but because they remember when Mia served them. From a shopping cart with more heart than resources, they come to pay their respects to a woman who understood that dignity matters as much as nutrition, that seeing someone's humanity is just as important as feeding their body. Sergeant Torres, his prosthetic leg now state-of-the-art, thanks to veterans' benefits that Ava helped him navigate, works part-time at the Soul Stew as a security guard. Not because the place needs protection, but because he wants to protect the woman who protected him when he had nothing left but hunger and pride, too stubborn to ask for help. Vera Thompson, the Vietnam veteran nurse, runs the Soul Stew's medical clinic, providing basic health care to anyone who walks through the doors. She's seen too much suffering to turn anyone away, and she understands that hunger and illness are often partners in the dance of poverty. Her clinic operates on the same principle as Mia's kitchen. No questions asked, no judgment passed, just help given to whoever needs it. The anniversary of that first bowl of soup has become an unofficial holiday in the neighborhood. A day when the community comes together to remember that individual acts of kindness can echo through decades. The celebration isn't grand or elaborate. It's just a shared meal where everyone sits at the same table, where the served become the servers, where former enemies break bread together in a ritual of reconciliation that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. Sophia, now 3 years into her sentence and genuinely transformed by the experience of serving others, wrote a letter that Mia keeps framed on her office wall. It's not an eloquent document. Sophia was never much with words when they weren't being used as weapons, but it's sincere in a way that cuts through all the legal language and courtroom drama to touch something essential about human nature's capacity for change. I spent 20 years building an empire on other people's hunger. The letter reads in Sophia's careful handwriting. I convinced myself I was helping, that I was providing structure and discipline to children who needed guidance. But I was really just feeding my own hunger for power and control. You showed me the difference between taking and giving, between using people and serving them. I can't undo 20 years of damage, but I can try to spend the rest of my life balancing the scales. The letter goes on to detail Sophia's plans for when she's released, her intention to use her business skills to support organizations like the Soul Stew, and her commitment to making amends, not just through restitution, but through service. It signs simply, Sophia Crane Sophia West, as if she's finally learning to take responsibility for both parts of her identity, instead of hiding behind titles and married names. So, next time you pass a soup kitchen or see someone hungry on the street or encounter a small act of kindness that seems insignificant in the grand scheme of things, remember Mia Harper and two orphan children who learned that love can be ladled from a bowl and served with crackers on the side. Listen close. You might just hear your name in the steam calling you to remember that in a world full of Sophia Cranes, we all have the choice to be Mia Harper instead. The choice to see hunger and fill it, to see loneliness and warm it, to see despair and offer it a seat at the table where everyone is welcome. And no one leaves empty, because that's the thing about soup kitchens, you see. They're not really about the soup at all. They're about the kitchen part. The place where strangers become family, where the broken get mended one meal at a time, and where ordinary people discover they have the power to change the world one bowl at a time. That torn apron Mia wore during those bridge years now hangs framed in the new Soul Stew kitchen. A reminder that sometimes the most important uniform is the one stained with service to others. Every morning when the staff arrives to begin preparing the day's meals, they touch that frame for luck, carrying forward the legacy of a woman who proved that the smallest acts of kindness can echo through decades, can transform lives, can literally move mountains of indifference and create valleys of compassion where none existed before. The recipe for that first bowl of soup, the one that started this whole chain of events, has been recreated and perfected by the Soul Stew's head chef, a former Food Network star who gave up his television career to serve meals to people who couldn't pay for them. It's called Mia's Special, and it's made with ingredients that can't be measured: a cup of compassion, a tablespoon of hope, a generous portion of human dignity, and love enough to feed anyone who's hungry. Every bowl served carries that same energy, that same intention, that same refusal to accept that anyone should go hungry in a world of abundance. The steam that rises from those bowls carries more than just the aroma of vegetables and broth. It carries the promise that someone cares, that someone sees you, that someone believes you deserve to be fed regardless of your circumstances or your ability to reciprocate. The Soul Stew now has 7 locations across 3 states, each one staffed partially by people who were once served there. People who understand hunger from the inside and refuse to let others experience what they experienced. The model has been replicated by other organizations, creating a network of compassion that stretches across the country like a web of hope. But it all started with one woman who saw 2 hungry children and decided that rules mattered less than hunger, that profit mattered less than people, that our own comfort mattered less than someone else's desperate need. It started with a choice that seemed small at the time, but rippled outward like circles on a pond, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined. And as I sit here in my chair, watching the snow fall outside my window on another December evening, I can see those circles still rippling outward. I can see the Soul Stew's warm lights cutting through the darkness, promising warmth and sustenance to anyone who needs it. I can see the yellow Lamborghini parked outside, its cheerful color a deliberate rejection of the darkness it once represented. Most importantly, I can see hope. Hope that systems can change, that justice can prevail, that individual acts of kindness matter in ways we may never fully understand. Hope that in a world that sometimes seems designed to crush the vulnerable, there will always be people like Mia Harper who choose compassion over convenience, service over interest, love over fear. The steam still rises from that kitchen every night, carrying with it the prayers of the fed and the hopes of the hungry. And somewhere in that steam, if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can hear the voice of every soul who was touched by kindness when they needed it most. You can hear them saying thank you. You can hear them saying they remember. You can hear them promising to pass it on. And in a world that too often forgets the power of simple human decency, that promise echoes louder than any symphony, more beautiful than any song, as enduring as the love that first filled a bowl with soup and changed the world one spoonful at a time. Years passed, and Mia's legacy continued to bloom in the quiet corners of the world. Soul Stew wasn't just a soup kitchen anymore. It had become a movement, a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of one person's kindness to change the world. Liam and Mia, once the hungry children who had been fed by a stranger, had become the architects of a new world. Through Nourish and their legal advocacy, they transformed the lives of countless others, ensuring that no child would ever go to bed hungry again. As the seasons changed, the lights of Soul Stew never dimmed. The staff, many of whom were once recipients of Mia's kindness, now served others with the same warmth and compassion they had received. They knew the value of a simple meal, the power of being seen, and the unspoken bond that connected them all. On the anniversary of that first bowl of soup, Mia stood at the front of the bustling kitchen, her heart full. She had seen it all: the darkness, the struggle, and the triumph. She had come full circle, not just as a woman who fed others, but as a beacon of hope, showing the world that kindness, though often small, could move mountains. And so, each night, as the steam rose from the pots of soup, carrying with it the echoes of gratitude, Mia whispered a quiet prayer. May we never forget the power of one bowl, one person, and one act of love. In the warmth of that kitchen, surrounded by the people whose lives she'd touched, Mia knew one truth above all: kindness never fades. It simply grows, multiplying in the hearts of those who choose to pass it on.